Indie games have come quite a long way since breaking into the mainstream during the 7th console generation. Going from cute little titles that remind people of a much simpler time in gaming from the amount of creative freedom on offer, to, as of last year, getting a Game of the Year awards next to massive AAA titles that would usually overshadow such a small project. There have been quite a few great indie titles coming out in the last few years, so let's count down a few of my favorites. Now, the number of entries might look weird to some, and there's a reason for that. When I was making a regular old top 10 list, I found myself leaving out some great titles to the point where there would be another top 10 in the honorable mention section. Because of this, I'll be bumping this up to a top 15. The good news is that you'll get a longer video with a wider variety of games to check out in case any of them look interesting. And to clear up what an indie game even is, I'm defining it as a game made by a moderate to small team with minimal help from any publisher when it comes to making the game itself, outside of temporary platform exclusivity deals, which is more about putting the game on the shelf more so than actually developing the game. So the games that small publishers are involved with, like Nicalis and Devolver Digital, are still fair game. And with all that said, let's get started. One thing that I enjoy about the indie scene is that a fairly unique idea can be tossed around, and if the game is great, it will at some point find an audience. That's what happened with super acrobatic rocket-powered battle cars. Jeez, that name is a mouthful. A humble little indie game that got a small following on PSN that was successful enough for the devs to make a follow-up called Rocket League. Does Rocket League have a plot? Maybe it's a post-apocalyptic game where smart cars have taken over the world. Or maybe it's a complex love triangle between Soccer Ball Kun, Netchance, Alpha, and Gamma, and their handful of wingmen trying to tip the scale for their preferred OTP. I don't know. Either way, this game is a blast. Rocket League is a soccer game based around controlling a rocket-propelled car to kick a ball into a goalpost, with the notable selling point being the fact that your cars can jump and use a rocket boost. And that's about it. A lot of the fun comes from combining your jumps, flips, and boost with a wacky physics engine to get the ball into the goal. It sounds simple, but then you realize that there can be 1 to 7 other players also going after the ball as well, and all that controlled chaos is where the fun is at. There are also several modes ranging from 1v1 mode to no items final destination to 4v4 pure chaos to just changing the ball into a hockey puck in an ice ring. So there is a good amount of variety on offer here in addition to the solid core gameplay. And I do like the unlocks since it's a nice way to reward players with quirky designs for their cars. It's simple and chaotic fun. What's not to like? The Sexy Brutale is one of the most fun games to talk about. After all, what other game has a near impossible genre to pin down? I mean, seriously. Time travel? Really? To narrow down the defining element of this sophisticated mess of a game, we have a point-and-click adventure game taking place in the mansion heavily reminiscent of the Spencer Mansion from RE1, with the chief mechanic being the ability to rewind time, akin to Majora's Mask, where the primary goal is to solve puzzles to save all the guests, like in Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. All of this is done to find out what led this lovely mansion to become a death trap in the first place.
Oh, well, that just sounds really easy. Just walk up to the person and tell them that they're in danger and to not do that one thing that'll get them kills.
Yeah, as a random side effect of being able to reverse time, you can't directly talk to anyone during their daily routine, or directly interfere with their killers. Only through indirectly stopping these characters from dying will allow you to temporarily break the time loop and you can finally talk to the guests that you're trying to save. After which, you'll gain a new ability relating to the guest in question, unlocking more rooms to travel through in the mansion during your next rewind. Alright, sounds good and all that, but how are the puzzles? Well, they vary in design and quality, but I'd say that a majority of them are pretty good, with the only sore thumb being a timing-based puzzle. None of them come close to hitting Portal levels of brilliance, but the variety on offer helps with making each part of the mansion feel like its own animal. Though the major selling point for me is the style of the game. While this is by no means a graphically impressive title, the mansion has a great aesthetic to it, and the soundtrack was well worth the price of entry alone. All these great things are tied together with an interesting story and a likable cast of characters. Going back to the title, while the name might raise an eyebrow for some, it is rather fitting. There are plenty of brutal deaths, but the scenarios of said deaths and the mansion it takes place in is rather artistic, almost beautiful in a way. Let's be frank, odds are you were expecting this on the list. Shovel Knight needs very little introduction, since the game has become one of the most popular indie titles that came out in 2014, and thanks to the free expansions and the many cameos rivaling Stan Lee in terms of quantity, a lot of people are familiar with this freaky fish guy. It also helps that his game is pretty good too. Shovel Knight is a 2D side-scroller reminiscent of... well, actually, it's more like a greatest hits of the entire NES era, taking inspiration from games like the Mega Man games with its colorful rogues gallery of bosses, Zelda 2 with its light RPG elements and towns to visit, Mario 3 with the map screen separating levels and having roaming enemies, and that one DuckTales game with a pogo move, as well as Castlevania with that clock tower level and the... knockback. Though all of these ideas are used without feeling like lazy pandering to the nostalgia crowd, thanks to some modern additions. Levels have far more checkpoints than the average NES title, the game is in a widescreen format, so hazards can't blindsight you as easily, and the life system is swapped out for dropping money, meaning that you are punished for dying, while not wasting your time with things like game overs. Not to mention the game can be tailored to be as challenging as you want. You can break all the checkpoints in the level, making the punishment for death extremely harsh, and upgrades like the different armors and the relics are optional. The story is also a highlight, since it has a decent amount of effort on display, since it does go beyond the simple premise of fighting the bad guys and their ringleader. The rogues gallery of bosses have a good amount of personality, to the point where 3 of them were given their own campaign, the dialogue is charming so the side characters stick out, and then there's the dream sequences with Shield Knight paints a strong relationship between her and our spade-wielding protag. That's a step above the Princess Peaches of yesterdecade. Shovel Knight is a modern classic that not only holds up as a solid game, but acts as the high watermark for retro-style indie games moving forward. Not bad for Yacht Club's first big project. Let's see how that ninja game turns out. Invoking the past is a common selling point with most indie developers. Hell, a handful of the games on this list have that as a selling point. Yeah, cause everything made in the past was objectively better than what we have nowadays. Ugh. But hey, for some games, old school pixel art alone won't suffice. Maybe you should go for a different style from a long bygone era. Enter Cuphead, the... Well, it's a good thing that I'm not a lazy hack, or this would financially bankrupt me. Enter Cuphead, the retro-style white-knuckle boss rush game from hell, from Studio MDHR, where the mischievous duo, Cuphead and his pal Mugman, make a bet with the devil, only to lose their souls in the process. This puts our fragile duo through a journey to claim the death of every other resident that also lost their soul to the devil in exchange for their freedom. Too bad none of these guys will give up their contracts without a fight. The game consists of boss fights with a colorful cast of baddies and a few run-and-gun levels akin to the levels in Contra, the latter of which are a nice way to add variety to the game and to get money to upgrade your character for the many battles ahead. The bosses vary from large and imposing to creative to just plain surreal with the changes between phases. A few of my personal favorites being Cagney Carnation, Dijin the Great, Rumor Honeybottoms, Kala Maria, Sally Stageplay, and the Phantom Express. An element that I like is that when you die, the game does show how far in the battle you are, giving off that one more try feeling, and you will get that feeling when you die for the upteenth time, followed by an immense feeling of satisfaction when you get in the zone and beat the boss on the millionth and first attempt. Though the major claim to fame with Cuphead is the gorgeous presentation. The rubber hose style of animation perfectly represents the 1950s, and the style of the game holds everything together. Studio MDHR went out of their way to not only animate all the characters in the same way models were animated at the time, but also all the animations are in 60 FPS, and it looks beautiful without being hampered by the limitations of the time, while still feeling authentic. Speaking of authenticity, the personality of Cuphead and Mugman has the mischievous vibe that older versions of Mickey Mouse was well known for having at the time, and the soundtrack sounds like it was pulled right from the era, with King Dice's theme being a personal standout. Some might question the position on the list, and well, I'll be frank, the roster of bosses has a mild consistency problem. While many of them are great, a few of the bosses are just alright, and to be honest, 2 of the bosses in particular stand out for being rather horrible. They act as a brick wall to progress, and neither of them are particularly satisfying to beat, though consider these to be the few low points in what effectively is an amazing title that everyone should give a shot. What I like about single-player FPSs as opposed to their multiplayer variants is the quality of the experience. In some cases, there are some creative and even innovative ideas on display. A solid example of this is from the indie scene is the most innovative FPS I've ever played, known as Superhot. Superhot involves you playing as a nerd, sitting in front of a computer screen chatting in DMs with your nerdy friends about video games. Well, at least the devs know their target audience. And you end up getting a cracked version of this new game called Superhot. In between your MLGs, the meta-narrative starts to seep in, and the walls between the virtual world and reality seem to be breaking down right in front of you. But pay no attention to losing all form of autonomy, and let's focus on that slick gameplay. In Superhot, you go from level to level, fighting goons that sound like broken glass when you kill them. It's a pretty standard affair until you realize that time only moves when you move. Or at least, according to the Steam description. In actuality, time moves ridiculously slow when you stand still. Even bullets take all the time in the world to collide with your dumb face. Imagine having a playable version of a Matrix fight scene from the perspective of Neo. Time moving so slow that you could dodge bullets, grab objects, throw it at enemies, punch out dudes to get their guns, and even cut bullets fired in midair. And later in the game, you can trade bodies with a nearby enemy to keep the flow going. And at the end of each level, you get a replay of what happened moving at normal speed, just adding to the power trip. The best way to describe this game would be the polar opposite of something like, say, Hotline Miami. In both cases you die in one hit, but in Superhot it's characterized by slow and strategic means of getting through the levels, as opposed to just adrenaline-fueled speed. But the catharsis is still there, and it's just as satisfying. The art style goes for a pseudo-mirror's edge look, with red on white being the primary colors of a level, with an even more minimalist approach to level geometry and character design. But in practice, it all works. Also, I just love how the menus are in ASCII font and those extra effects making the screen look like an older monitor. It adds a nice distinction between the story bits and the gameplay. Though I think the only real downside is that there's no level editor, which is weird since the entire game consists of white areas filled with the same enemy models, so I don't think that it would be that hard to implement. And also that it's a little on the short side for such a steep asking price. But hey, it's a fun game that's worth picking back up after completing it with some side content that gets unlocked, and it does go on sale every so often. So I'd say it's worth a shot, especially since Superhot is the most innovative shooter that I've ever played.
Superhot.
The indie scene has been around for a long while now. While it gained a noticeable uptick in attention during the 7th gen of consoles, there were plenty of small devs and studios tossing their ideas into what was the Wild West of gaming. One of these devs went by the alias of Pixel, who tossed a small pet project he made in college out into the gaming scene, and it was considered shockingly good if you want to completely understate things. Before Shovel Knight was a thing, when the average Joe thought of indie games, they thought of titles like Braid, Castle Crashers, and Cave Story. Is it weird to feel nostalgic for an indie game? I mean, it came out quite a while ago, and it was the face of indie games until more recent titles came out, so yeah, I think the feeling is quite justified. The story of this system of caves involves a robot named Quote, waking up to find a village of rabbit people called Mabiga being captured by a sorceress in a lunchbox channeling his inner Kool-Aid Man. Sounds like a silly premise for a game, but it sets you up for the inevitable gut punch when the red flowers are introduced, and later the origins of robots like Quote and Curly are given. The plot is simple when it's all written out, but the delivery, along with the simplicity of the presentation, is what elevates it up to the surprisingly great heights that it's been viewed as to this day. Aside from the story, the combat is pretty solid. It's an action platformer where you jump and shoot enemies down with an ever-expanding arsenal of weapons, similar to Metroid. The arsenal has your basics like a pistol, a missile launcher, a fireballs, a bubble gun, and a sword. All of these weapons can be leveled up with Triforce chunks that fall off of enemies, though to balance things out, your guns actually level down after getting hit, rewarding players for skillfully dodging attacks. While the game is in the Metroidvania genre, it's a fairly linear affair, but you can backtrack to earlier areas for some optional items. Just don't expect the maze-like levels that you'd find in the 2D Metroids, though Pixel's love of that series is pretty easy to see. It's a pretty fun adventure with a good amount of environments to explore and a great lineup of bosses, all of which are a unique and fun challenge. Then you get to the last level and a tough but manageable difficulty curve turns into a vertical line where you have to fight 5 bosses with no save points in between. In most cases, this would be an infuriating black spot on a game, but Cave Story is awesome, so I'll make an exception. A while ago, I bought a game called Dust: An Elysian Tale after hearing the overwhelming praise from friends and peers. I didn't like it as much as they did. The reason for this would pad out the video, but sometime after I was hearing about a title called Ori and the Blind Forest, which was getting accolades as one of the best games that came out in 2015. Though for me it was giving off the same vibes as Dust, and I feared history would be repeating itself, leaving me with a solid title that didn't appeal to my weird tastes. This is one of those situations where I am oh so glad to be wrong. Ori and the Blind Forest is a Metroidvania with a high emphasis on exploration of its massive world. When compared to most Metroidvanias, there is a higher emphasis on platforming challenges as opposed to raw combat. It's there, but it's more of a micro-obstacle when compared to the world that you traverse. What helps with the exploration is that the controls are silky smooth, and the number of moves that you can acquire throughout the game makes traveling the world a joy. The other element that makes this a standout title is the ability to make your own save points. That sounds like it would make the game too easy, but the abundance of instant death spikes are enough to make this feel like a necessary addition to ward off the unquantifiable frustration of dying along with traveling across several continents to get back to the spot where you last died at. Many of the abilities are used to great effect to improve the flow of platforming. One of my favorite of these abilities is Bash, which allows you to turn hanging objects, projectiles, and even enemies into jumping off points. This changes the dynamic of platforming as even enemy projectiles becomes a means of traveling around the world, and it does help out with puzzles. The world design is something to behold, as it is hella big. Despite all the areas taking place in a forest, there's a masterful use of art design to give each area in the game its own distinct look and atmosphere. In each area you have a Zelda-esque dungeon to help with reviving the Jinzo tree, and every dungeon has its own gimmick and type of puzzles, with my favorite being the second one, and its use of gravity mechanics. And at the end of each dungeon there is an exhilarating escape sequence, putting your platforming skills to the test. The story is masterfully told, with an emphasis on character expression. What starts as a simple plot of saving the forest gets some texture in the form of a small but engaging cast of characters. Despite the characters being color-coded as black and white, the story is more of a nuanced tale, with the major themes of the story being love, loss, rebirth, and the core theme, family. It's a game that excels in both storytelling and gameplay so well that I can't help but be excited to play the sequel when I get the chance. One cute idea that the indie scene likes to do is translating complex 3D games into a more simplistic retro-style 2D game. It's a testament to how much the devs know about the original title when the comparison is just the loss of a Z-axis, and it keeps the appeal of the original game that it was inspired by. Though as a side effect, devs tend to alter things just enough to make their game a completely different experience. Minecraft is a survival crafting game where building and crafting items are the main attraction. Then comes along Terraria, a game that makes a few small changes here and there, leading to things feeling a bit different. The kind of different where Minecraft ends with you fighting a dragon, and Terraria ends with you fighting a cosmic horror from beyond the veil of space and time. Terraria is the type of game that I'm actively avoiding due to the fact that my upload schedule will plummet to even lower lows if I picked it back up, though I wouldn't have thought of that with its slow opening. The opening isn't necessarily cold as much as it makes sub-zero temperatures feel like a sauna. Thankfully I had a friend to help me pass the first hour or so to get an idea of the general game flow, which is exploration, digging tunnels, finding treasures, and fighting the many bosses in the world. I mean, yeah, mining and crafting are part of the game, but it's far from the core. The treasure runs on a Diablo-style kind of stats, so even if you find a similar piece of gear, the stats might make one weapon or item the better option. The sheer number of bosses in this game is impressive, and their sheer size and the ability to outmaneuver the player making them an intense fight for your life, and every single fight a treat. Though pro tip, make an arena, most of them can fly so no one will judge you. After killing each boss you get a weapon, an item, or a material to craft with and get stronger. Then you just go into another biome, fight new enemies, kill more bosses, and get even more over the top stuff. And there is a lot of game here for the low price tag on offer, and if you can get into the right mindset, you'll have a very absorbing game that will ruin any and all forms of productivity moving forward. Also, the multiplayer is a blast. You get some extra help to explore, mine, help with boss fights, and the best part is taking advantage of how bombs don't have friendly fire. Wait, that doesn't sound right. Who wrote that? Damn it all. One of the accomplishments of any medium is to get some form of empathy from the player when it comes to how we see the characters in the world that these people have worked so hard to create. Often, there's a feeling of artificiality or gaminess that keeps people from connecting to the world on a deeper level. So, leave it to the game with the cartoon animals as the main cast of characters to be some of the most relatable characters that I've seen in a video game. Night in the Woods is a game about sobering reality catching up to your nostalgia-obsessed young adult ass. You play as a college dropout, Mae Brzezowski, returning to the town she grew up in, and like revisiting an old town, there are a few things have stayed the same, but some things look a bit different, though more likely it's a change in perspective. The gameplay is where I'm gonna lose a few people. Night in the Woods is a town exploration game, where every in-game day is spent with Mae walking around Possum Springs and talking to the many characters that populate it, reading flavor text about the town, the people, or events in the past, with the odd minigame or dream sequence to spice things up. Experiencing the narrative is a battle of juxtaposition between things like the colorful and vibrant art style with the pretty grounded and relatable world, the warm feeling of home with the cold reality of it not being the bastion of safety you thought it was, the general normal exterior with the surprisingly out there murder mystery angle that it goes for in the second half, or the likability of the main cast with the snarky and at times off-putting nature of the main character. If you're looking for the BoJack Horseman of video games, you found something to that effect. The main character Mae is considered the sticking point of the game, and is either seen as the best or worst element of the game, depending on who you ask. She joins a modern trend of having the main character be relatable, but also tragically flawed to the point where moments of sympathy are hard to give. Yes, you have dialogue options, but both options that are given seem to be filtered through Mae's limited perspective of the world around her, leading to a lot of awkward moments. At times, her attitude is so off-putting that she becomes the weakest link in her group of genuinely likable friends. Seriously, f*** you, Mae, for being so gosh darn unlikable. And, thank you, Mae, for being a main character that I can personally relate to in both high and low moments. It's a game that if you can get in the right mindset, it can leave a strong impact with you, hence why it's ranked so highly with me. Also, that Demon Tower minigame is better than it has any rights to be. Seriously, this is good enough to be sold as its own game. It is that good. Boss fights are the cornerstone of most video games. They act as the high mark of most levels, a test of the mechanics that you've learned, or just the climax to a good storyline. Now imagine a game where boss fights was like 99% of the game. You'd have a title like Fury. Similar to the previously mentioned Cuphead, Fury is a boss rush game where you go up against an array of creative and colorful bosses. Think No More Heroes, just with a lot less game in between the major fights. The setup is that you're breaking out of the most elaborate prison in the world, with every area having its own biome and guardian to keep you from leaving. You're also accompanied by a guy with a rabbit mask that might or might not even be there. There's not much in terms of plot, but what I like is that every line of dialogue is used effectively to paint an image of who you are and the motivations of every boss in the game. The meat of this game is in the boss fights, and holy shit, the bosses are really good. I've implied that boss quality is important, and honestly, I feel that almost every boss in this game hits a high watermark for me in terms of a quality fight, with only one boss I'd honestly say I outright dislike. A few of my favorites being the Strap for her creative and creepy design, the Line for his memorable dialogue and creative use of time manipulation, the Burst with her tough as nail battles and making a stealthy boss actually fun to fight, and the Edge, who acts as the ultimate test of your ability to block attacks. What helps is that there is an interesting take on the life system, so you can only lose so many times before the boss fight resets and you have to start from the very beginning, giving every fight some tension. But every time you clear a phase, you get a new life, along with your health bar being reset, giving the player a good push forward with each phase. In between each battle is a bunch of walking bits that feel so simplistic there's actually an auto walk button, and surprisingly I've found myself liking this part of the game as well. Seeing as just mindless action would lead to a bit of fatigue, and it's a good way of creating a calm atmosphere before the storm that is the next major boss fight, kinda like one of those more quiet scenes in Samurai Jack. What helps is that it gave me the opportunity to appreciate the game's gorgeous art style made by the artist who made Afro Samurai, and this game's amazing soundtrack, with the OST ranking as some of my favorite music that I've heard in a video game, from composers like Carpenter Burnt, Waveshaper, Knight, and the Toxic Avenger, making each environment have its own feel and giving each boss its own memorable theme, with Your Mind being my favorite boss theme of all time. It's a memorable experience that I damn well recommend that everyone gives a chance, as what this game does well, it shines brighter than many of its peers, and then some. Okay, picture this. You versus the game that everyone abandoned you in favor of, including me. Anyone else remember that weird phase where the vocal majority of people just concluded that Kickstarter was just a breeding ground for disappointment? Or, was just a waste of money?
And make the bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night.
I blame the massive amount of trashy Kickstarters, since, well, every idea sounds amazing in a text blurb or in a well-edited trailer, but that doesn't mean that the final product will meet said expectations. Also, all those Kickstarters to make a bowl of potato salad isn't sending the right message about the site either. What's worse is that all the bad Kickstarters tend to drown out the handful of good ones that do meet up to the promises made. One of them is a little gem from Gears for Breakfast. A Hat in Time is an indie platformer, but it's one of those more rare cases where an indie team decided to tackle a 3D platformer whose inspirations can be traced back to games like Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Psychonauts, with the main goal to get all the timepieces that were lost over several bizarre and diverse worlds. Worlds like the Mario Sunshine-inspired Mafia Town, the flashy film studio Battle of the Birds, the surprisingly creepy Subcon Forest, or the free-roam Japanese level-inspired Yakuza Metro, all of which are distinct and fun to travel through. Each one offering something different in terms of structure with how you go about getting the timepieces and who you have to deal with along the way. Each of the worlds is filled with a colorful cast of characters that act as the highlight for the location that they hold dominion over. The best example of this is War of the Birds, where DJ Grooves and the conductor are trying to make the better film and you are the star of both productions. Or the Snatcher, who puts you on a bizarre list of jobs throughout his forest before fighting him off at the end. The inspiration to Mario and Banjo can be seen through the fluid moveset, where the simple act of running and jumping to traverse the world is just a joy to do. The jump arcs and the floatiness are just right, the downward lunge to get a boost is great for speedrunning a level, and the homing attack is good if your umbrella isn't enough to deal with the enemies, and the camera is pretty good for the majority of the game. Quite a few of these aspects are usually hard to pin down from the many mediocre 3D platformers in the 6th generation that fell short in this regard, so to see an indie team do so well is impressive to see. Hats play a big role in the game, where over the course of the game you'll find a few hats to use alongside your default top hat. There's a hat for running, creating explosions, turning to a heavy ice sculpture for floor panels, to make platforms transparent or solid, or even to slow down time. Altogether, this feels like a highlights reel of the best platformers that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s, all wrapped into a concise but fun package. I mean, what more could you ask for? Besides a better console port. Number 4 is a retro-style pixel art game characterized by intense challenge reminiscent of games of yesterdecade. Boy, does that sound like a song and dance that we've heard in this independent circle. Hell, I've gone through this 3 times on the list alone. Innovation is important, but execution holds a lot more weight when I look at a game as a whole. It separates what's derivative from what's truly compelling, hence why Celeste is something special. Celeste is a simple tale of battling adversity while dealing with the bizarre. Madeline is a young adult who decided one day to travel up Celeste Mountain for her own personal reasons. So she takes a ride on a gondola up to the top and gets in line to take a selfie to show off to all her online friends. A short but uneventful... Yeah, I'm messing around, though there are remnants of what was a failed tourist trap in the environment details. What actually happened is that you have to get up the old-fashioned way, though for reasons unknown, you gain the ability to do a mid-air dash, and things only get weirder from there, with each section of the mountain having a new gimmick to overcome, with some of them consisting of black blobs that grow around the floor and fly all over the place, harsh winds that impede your jumping, or platforms that react to your dashing in a dark level. It all ties together the theme of the game, which is about battling anxiety and depression, with the mountain's many obstacles acting as a metaphor for the plight that Madeline is going through. And, yeah, it definitely resonated with me. The game is a Super Meat Boy-esque 2D platformer through some tough-as-nails level, though unlike Meat Boy, I never felt things got too hard. It accomplishes this in a few ways. For one, the spaces between checkpoints is not large enough to make a death have a large setback, and similar to Meat Boy, you respawn fast, so it's only a short moment before respawning, and finally, the music does a great job in allowing the player to zone out in more difficult moments. This especially helps in the B-side levels, where things go from Super Meat Boy to I Wanna Be the Guy in terms of difficulty. The theme of this game is overcoming adversities in life, so to have these feelings manifested in a video game is great. And the little touches like how the loading screens have a message from the devs telling you to not feel ashamed of how many times you die in a level really does help with overcoming the challenges the game puts before you. In other words, give it a shot. Yeah, I think the self-imposed challenge was a mistake. One of the many indie games to come out in 2017, Hollow Knight was a massive surprise. This game came out from a studio that no one heard about, and it quickly became an instant classic in both the Metroidvania genre and the indie scene in general, with this being my favorite indie Metroidvania game that I've played thus far. And I've dipped my toe into quite a number of games in this genre, so that means a lot. Despite how small its protagonist realistically is, Hollow Knight stands tall amongst its forebears like Symphony of the Night and Super Metroid. Some might look at Hollow Knight and see a large number of ideas blatantly taken from games like the previously mentioned Super Metroid and Symphony of the Night, as well as Dark Demon Souls. What works with Hollow Knight is that, in the broad strokes, you can see the inspirations for this game, but it executes most of these ideas so well that I really don't care all that much. You play as a small knight returning to a kingdom in a state of ruin, known as Hollow Nest, with Team Cherry taking the whole idea of making you feel like an insignificant insect to its logical extreme. You explore the kingdom to find an infection has spread all over the world, and you have to hopefully find a way to stop it, while saving the handful of people still alive in this dying world. Though what I like about Hollow Knight is that, yes, the world has a dreary atmosphere, but it never goes into full-on nihilistic views about how doomed everything is, with many of the characters even having a more optimistic feel, giving you some form of motivation to save this world. And what a world it is. I consider the level design and structure of the world in a Metroidvania to be the bread and butter of the experience, and the world of Hollow Knight is the thing to marvel at. There are many environments in this world, all of which have their own distinct atmosphere and vibe to it, despite all of them taking place in an underground city. Simple things like how the biomes will subtly change when traveling between areas shows a great amount of attention to detail. The way that all the worlds are connected seems well thought out, with the City of Tears being located beneath a massive underwater lake, explaining why it's raining all the time. From the simple structures of the Forgotten Crossroads to the funky fungal waste to the beautiful City of Tears to the revelations found in the ancient Bastion, the world of Hollow Knight always has an interesting environment to find in every corner of its massive world. The combat, while simple, is satisfying to use, and with the new abilities you gain by exploring the world, as well as all the charms you can equip, it makes fighting enemies and bosses a fun time. Speaking about that, the charms in this game strike a perfect balance between the versatility of the items, like in a Castlevania game, and every item's holding a good amount of weight, like in a Metroid game. Most of the charms can be useful in the right situations, and because of their varied and wild effects, it makes the act of picking up a new one always exciting. And the lore of the world is pretty great as well, with it gradually feeding the player information on how the world works, as well as subtly explain the motives of all the characters in the game, and their relation to one another. Though there is a lot left to interpretation, with my favorite theory that Zode is actually the bastard child of the king that knew he f***ed up when Zode started talking. And with all the free expansions, I can definitely say that for their first major project, Team Cherry not only made a damn good Metroidvania game, but one that also raised the bar for what a Metroidvania game can be. Hopefully Retro and Igarashi can follow up with as much grace, and I'm really looking forward to Silksong when that comes out. Also, f*** Deep Nest. The rogue genre is pretty damn intimidating when you look at it from afar. These games offer a near infinite amount of gameplay, since the game will never be the same when you go through it a second, third, or 50th time. If variety is the spice of life, then a roguelite is a trip through a spice cabinet. These games offer a lot, and because of that, I find that it takes a lot longer to determine if a roguelite, light, whatever you call it, type of game is good or not. I'm left with a lot to chew on, so with 200 plus hours on the game, I think it's safe to assume that I have a solid grasp of what makes The Binding of Isaac a damn good game. After making a tough-as-nails 2D platformer in the form of Super Meat Boy, Edmund McMillen shifted gears by making a dungeon exploration roguelite structured in the same vein as the first Legend of Zelda game. Though his trademark overuse of bursts of challenge, bloody imagery, and shit are here and very much accounted for, especially the shit. The story, what little there is anyway, involves a young boy named Isaac living alone with his overly Christian mother. She hears the voice of God one day and is told to strip Isaac of all his belongings and then his life. Though Isaac decides to jump into the basement door below his room to escape his mother, only to find a series of catacombs with nightmare fuel around every corner. The game was a hit, but due to the limitations of the engine, plus it being the first few games in this new style of roguelites, meant that it never really achieved its maximum potential. So with the help of a new team, the game was given a rebirth. With a new engine that runs smoother, a new art style, controller support, and many more items. The game involves you running around a randomly generated top-down style dungeon where you have to fight a boss to get to the next floor, and eventually fight your mother at the end. Along the way, you'll find treasure rooms, shops, treasure chests, all containing random items and power-ups to get through the current floor and subsequent floors a lot easier, or harder if you get a bad item. In the original Binding of Isaac, some items interacted with one another and synergized to make an even stronger combination. This was taken to a new level in Rebirth, with item synergies being the major addition to the game. Very few items cancelled each other out, meaning that you can make Isaac unstoppable if you pick the right items. A major part of the Binding of Isaac is the aspect of unlocking stuff after a run, and after doing a specific action like beating a boss or a floor for the first time, you'll unlock a new item, enemy, boss, another floor, or even a new character to play as. This leads to a massive amount of content to experience, and the game constantly refreshing itself with new stuff to experience. And if somehow you find a way to exhaust all of the content from the base game, there are, as of now, 2 expansions to add more content to the game, in the form of a new mode called Greed Mode, even more items and synergies, and new bosses that expand the lore of the game. I think what I like so much about the game is that there's just enough in your control that skill is rewarded, such as the Devil Rooms being accessible if you take no red heart damage, and as of Afterbirth Plus, you can use the new UI to make more informed choices on what items to get. Plus, the fact that not every run lasts all that long means that even if you get a painfully bad run, you can restart and potentially get a more fun run on the next time around. Anyhow, before I get to number 1, here are some honorable mentions. Fez. A solid puzzle platformer whose quality makes you forget about the shrieking numbnuts that made it. Skullgirls. One of the few fighting games that I can actually see myself getting into, with a beautifully animated cast of characters. Golf with your friends. A simple and fun game to play with your friends, with all the wacky courses that you can go through. Axiom Verge. A great Metroidvania with a solid gameplay setup, and a pretty interesting world to navigate. Dead Cells. A great roguelike Metroidvania hybrid, though, as previously mentioned, I feel like I should experience more of the content before putting it up on a pedestal. Enter the Gungeon. A similar spot to Dead Cells, with great pixel art, a soundtrack, and a gun selection, but I'll need more time on this one before I can come to any major conclusions. Katana Zero. Take Hotline Miami, turn it into a side-scroller, and make the moment-to-moment gameplay a blast and a half. In addition, also just add a boppin' soundtrack just to make things even better. And with all that said, let's go on to number 1. Going through the many games that I played throughout the years, very few stand out in my mind as the highest tier of quality. Those that not only stand out amongst the great games that came out around the time, but have cemented themselves as a modern classic. There have been many good games shown thus far, but none can match the quality of Toby Fox's magnum opus, Undertale. The Earthbound-inspired pacifism simulator has gained quite a reputation for itself. Beyond the simple memes the game is known for, this game has become beloved for its wonderful cast of characters, quirky sense of humor, a memorable soundtrack, a battle system that's pretty shallow when you're fighting enemies on the more violent routes, several endings that I couldn't really be bothered to get despite how short the single playthrough is, all of which solidifies Undertale as another honorable mention. Anyhow, let's get on to the real number 1 entry. When it comes to the greats that the independent part of the game industry has made, very few have grabbed me and left an impact as lasting and as well as Hyperlight Drifter. Hyperlight Drifter is one of the surprisingly few Zelda-likes out there, taking cues from games like A Link to the Past, Devil May Cry, Bloodborne, and even has a little bit of Shadow of the Colossus in there. The method of exploring the overworld, from the camera angle to the level archetypes to even the style of the bushes, takes some of the best visual cues from the SNES era of the Zelda series, with some aspects taken from Majora's Mask, with there only being 4 dungeons and the major city being in the center of the game world. And what a beautiful world it is. I have a fondness for pixel art, as seen all throughout this list, but Hyperlight takes it to a new level with vivid landscapes and a gorgeous aesthetic for its locations, all of which is using Game Maker as its engine, which, to put into perspective, it made the far more simplistic looking Undertale and Nuclear Throne, so Hyperlight's incredible pixel art should not be understated. What got me hooked was the slick and skillful gameplay. Combat in this game is a treat, with Hyperlight being a hack and slash taking cues from games like Devil May Cry and even Bloodborne. The DMC-esque combat is fast and stylish, with a satisfying system for close quarters combat that has some excellent sound design for slashing away at baddies. The Bloodborne comparison comes with how lethal combat can be and the limited health items that you find around the overworld, keeping the intensity of combat high throughout the entire journey. You also get a gun to handle enemies from afar, and a genius design choice is that the bullets actually can only be replenished by slashing enemies up close. All of this along with the well-implemented dashing ability that rewards skillful movement, making combat a fun spectacle of watching pixelated carnage, and even makes traversing the overworld a joy to do. The plot is rather understated, with you playing as a drifter traveling around the world to activate 4 monoliths, in a desperate attempt to cure a plague that's slowly killing this broken world. Though the thing that stuck with me about Hyperlight are the themes of the game, specifically the theme of contrast that can be seen all throughout. The heavy use of saturated and contrasting colors with all the designs of all the characters, the fantasy-style overworld contrasted by the sci-fi-styled underground, the beauty of the world being contrasted by all the death and destruction that has plagued it over the course of what feels like decades, or how lively the world and its characters look contrasted by how this is far from a great place to live in, with every area suffering in some way. That's not even going into the other themes that can be found, such as the theme of death, or the symbolism found in the protagonist and all the bosses being named after the major arcana. In the same way Shadow of the Colossus, it leaves a lot for the player to chew on with its plot and lore, even going as far as to not have any written dialogue in the whole game. Often when discussing video games, there's the question, can video games be seen as a higher form of art? And often when trying to show some of the strengths of the medium, people bring out some standout examples. Many will bring in the big names like the BioShocks and the Shadow of the Colossuses, and I can see why they would. However, due to the raw expression displayed and showing the many strengths of the medium as a whole, along with just being a great game, I'd go with Hyperlight Drifter. A simple little indie game that has left an impact on me and ranks them highly amongst my favorites. This has been the Renegade Master, signing out. Hey, how's it going? Post-credits Renegade Master here. Just wanted to say thanks for watching and sorry for the wait. Just wanted to let you guys know that I have a Discord and a Twitter to keep up with my future projects and all other shenanigans, and if you want to keep up with my videos, I'd recommend subscribing. There will be a next video soon, and hopefully I'm not going to disappear for another few months while trying to make it. Until then, I hope you have a nice day.